The needle on my Patek Philippe was shaking, not because my hand was shaking, because I was shaking it, on purpose, the way a director shakes a prop before the cameras roll. My son sat across the Thanksgiving table, watching my spoon rattle against the china, watching soup spill onto the white tablecloth I had bought in Milan 30 years ago. He didn't rush to help me. He smiled. That was the moment I understood. My own child was timing my decline like a stock he had shorted. If you're watching this video, drop a comment and tell me what state you are watching from tonight. And if you have ever felt like a stranger inside your own family's smile, hit that subscribe button before we begin. Because what happened to me next in that dining room was only the first lie in a war that would take everything I built to survive. My name is Roderick Beaumont. I am 68 years old, and I built Beaumont Freight from 2 rusted trucks and a warehouse lease I could barely afford into the largest privately held logistics empire on the West Coast. I built it with these hands that once loaded crates at 4 in the morning in the freezing Seattle rain. I did not inherit a single dollar. I clawed my way up from nothing, and by the time I was 45, I had 4,000 employees who depended on my judgment to feed their families. I was not a man who trembled. I was not a man who forgot things. But on that Thanksgiving evening, sitting at the head of my own dining table in the house I had built with Margaret, my late wife, I let my spoon shake violently in my hand until the soup splashed across the tablecloth like a wound opening. My son Lucian did not rush to my side. He did not ask if I was all right. He simply watched, his fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes calculating something behind that practiced, pitying smile. Lucian was 38 years old, the current chief executive officer of the company I had spent 40 years building, and he wore that title the way a boy wears his father's coat, too big, dragging on the floor, tripping him with every step. He had gone to Stanford. He had come back with a vocabulary full of words like disruption and scalability, and a hunger for the kind of Silicon Valley applause that Beaumont Freight, with its trucks and its warehouses and its unglamorous, honest profit, could never give him. Beside him sat Cordelia, his wife, my daughter-in-law, a mergers and acquisitions attorney with a smile so polished it could cut glass. She was 36, brilliant, cold, and utterly without mercy in a boardroom, the kind of woman who could dismantle a company's defenses in an afternoon and never raise her voice once. She reached over and dabbed at the spilled soup with her napkin, her touch gentle, her eyes anything but. "Dad, are you feeling all right?" she asked, her voice pitched exactly 1 octave too soft, the voice people use on the very old and the very young. I let my eyes go glassy. I let my mouth hang open a fraction of an inch. I let them see an old man disappearing into the fog. This was the insight I had learned in my 60s, the insight nobody warns you about when you are young and strong and certain you will never grow old. The moment your children start looking at you with pity instead of respect, you have already become a liability in their eyes. I had watched it happen to other men, friends of mine, titans of industry reduced to line items on a spreadsheet the second their hands began to shake or their memory began to slip. I had sworn it would never happen to me. And it hadn't. Not really. Because what Lucian and Cordelia did not know, what nobody in that dining room knew, was that I had been performing this decline for 6 months. Every tremor was rehearsed. Every forgotten name was chosen. I was 68 years old and sharper than I had been at 40, and I was about to prove it. It started 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon, when my accountant of 20 years, a quiet, meticulous man named Harold Bristow, requested an emergency meeting and slid a folder across my desk without a word. Inside was a trail of wire transfers, small at first, then larger, then staggering, all routed from a subsidiary account under Lucian's direct authority into something called Ignis Dynamics, a startup that promised to revolutionize freight logistics with an artificial intelligence platform that, as far as I could tell, existed mostly in a pitch deck and my son's imagination. Over 14 months, Lucian had siphoned $11 million out of Beaumont Freight to prop up a company that had never shipped a single package, never signed a single client, and never once shown me the courtesy of asking permission. I did not confront him. A younger version of myself would have stormed into his office and thrown that folder across his desk. But I had learned something in 40 years of running a company through 3 recessions and 2 near bankruptcies. You do not corner a wounded animal until you know exactly how it will bite. I needed to see how deep the rot went before I cut it out. I needed evidence that could not be argued away in a family therapy session, evidence that would stand up in a courtroom, in a boardroom, in the court of public opinion, if it ever came to that. And so I decided to give my son exactly what he wanted most in the world without him ever having to ask for it. I decided to become weak. I called Leland Hobbs that same night, the only man in Seattle I trusted with my life and my legacy in equal measure. Leland had been my lawyer for 30 years, since before Beaumont Freight had its first warehouse, and he had buried his own wife the same year I buried Margaret, which meant he understood a particular kind of grief that makes a man either soft or unbreakable. Leland was unbreakable. "Roderick," he said when I laid out the plan, "you want to fake dementia to catch your own son stealing from you." I told him it was more elegant than that. I told him I wanted to build a trap so beautiful that Lucian would walk into it smiling, believing he had won. Together we designed the first snare. We created a holding entity called Northgate Horizon Trust, an entity that on paper looked like a forgotten offshore account I had established decades earlier and never touched, an account that appeared to hold a staggering fortune I had never disclosed to my family. It was bait, nothing more, a shining coin dropped in the grass to see which rat would come sniffing. Leland structured the paperwork so that any inquiry into my mental competency would trigger an automatic disclosure of Northgate Horizon Trust to whoever held power of attorney over my affairs. I wanted Lucian to see that fortune. I wanted him to taste it. I wanted greed to do what 40 years of fatherly discipline never could, which was to finally show me exactly who my son had become. Within weeks, the smart home devices began appearing in my house. A doorbell camera here, a motion sensor there, a small white speaker on my nightstand, that Cordelia assured me was simply a way to check on me remotely, to keep me safe while I lived alone on 6 acres of land that suddenly, according to her, felt too large and too dangerous for a man my age. I let them install every device. I let them build their surveillance network brick by brick, because every camera they placed in my home was also a camera capturing the exact moment they believed they had outsmarted a dying old man. I performed for those cameras the way I'd once performed for shareholders. I dropped my keys. I called Lucian by his late uncle's name. I stood in my own kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at the refrigerator, pretending I could not remember what I had walked in there to find. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Lucian came to me with a document. He called it a temporary operational transfer, a simple formality, he said, just to make sure the company ran smoothly while I focused on my health. His hand trembled slightly as he held out the pen, though he tried to hide it, and I understood that trembling far better than he understood mine. It was greed disguised as concern, exactly as I'd designed it. I looked at the document for a long moment, long enough to make him sweat, and then I signed my name with a shaking, uncertain hand, letting the signature drift slightly off the line the way a confused old man's signature might. That night, alone in my study with the door locked and the surveillance cameras pointed at an empty room, I poured myself 2 fingers of scotch and allowed myself, for the first time in 6 months, to smile the way I actually felt. I had handed my son a rope, and I was watching with a father's patient cruelty exactly how far he would let himself hang from it. Somewhere in that house, Cordelia was reviewing footage of my decline, cataloging my failures, building her case. Somewhere, Lucian was celebrating with champagne, believing the empire was finally his. Neither of them understood that the frailest, most pitiful old man in Seattle held every card in the deck, and the game had only just begun. I thought I understood the size of my son's greed. I was wrong. Greed, I learned in the weeks that followed, does not have a ceiling. It only has a next number, always larger than the last, always just out of reach, always justifying one more betrayal to close the gap. Declan Fitch, the private investigator I had hired through a shell company so obscure, even Leland struggled to trace the payments back to me, called me on a burner phone on a cold Tuesday morning with a voice tight enough to cut wire. "Roderick," he said, "it's bigger than the 11 million. They're not just stealing from you, they're selling you." Declan had spent 3 weeks embedded in the financial underworld of Seattle's private equity circuit, and what he found made my siphoned millions look like a rounding error. Lucian and Cordelia were in advance secret negotiations with a vulture fund called Ferris Crown Capital to sell Beaumont Freight, my life's work, my 40 years of 4 in the morning mornings, at a price roughly 60% below its true market value. In exchange, Lucian would receive a seat on Ferris Crown's Global Advisory Board, a title with no real power but tremendous prestige, the exact kind of shiny nothing my son had always mistaken for meaning. Cordelia, for her part, had negotiated a separate consulting retainer worth $2 million a year, paid quietly, invisibly, for helping to gut the very company that had built her house, paid for her cars, and financed the education that made her so very good at destroying people like me. I sat with that information for a full day before I moved. A younger man would have called an emergency board meeting and torn the deal apart with his bare hands. But I was not interested in simply stopping them. Stopping a thief only teaches him to hide better next time. I wanted to catch my son in a crime so undeniable, so black and white, that no lawyer on earth could argue it away as a misunderstanding between a confused father and a well-meaning son. I wanted federal charges. I wanted handcuffs. And so I built the second trap, and I built it with a patience that surprised even Leland, who had known me for 30 years and thought he had seen every version of my temper. Leland and I invented a man named Bram Ostrander, a fictional angel investor with a fabricated 20-year track record in logistics technology, a man who supposedly represented a consortium eager to inject capital into Ignis Dynamics, the very startup Lucian had been bleeding my company to fund. We built Bram a website, a LinkedIn profile with 4,000 fabricated connections, even a voice actor to handle phone calls in a smooth, confident baritone that Lucian found instantly, pathetically trustworthy. Bram Ostrander offered Lucian something no honest investor ever would: advance, non-public knowledge of a coming valuation spike in Ignis Dynamics. Information Bram claimed to have obtained through a source inside a competing firm about to announce an acquisition. It was, in plain language, an invitation to commit insider trading, wrapped in the silk ribbon of a father figure's approval, since Bram made certain to mention, casually, warmly, that he had once worked closely with a man named Roderick Beaumont and admired him greatly. Lucian took the bait within 48 hours. He funneled $3 million of Beaumont Freight capital into Ignis Dynamics shares through 2 offshore accounts, timed precisely around the fabricated announcement Bram had promised. I watched the wire transfers land in real time on a private dashboard Declan had built for me, each one a nail I was quietly hammering into my son's coffin. It was elegant. It was airtight. It was, I believed, the beginning of the end for my son's reign of theft. I sat in my study that night with Leland on speakerphone, and for the first time in 6 months, I allowed myself to imagine the moment I would finally drop the mask, the moment I would watch my son's face collapse when he understood that the frail old fool feeding chickens in his own memory had been building a federal case against him the entire time. Leland warned me not to celebrate too early. He had built too many airtight cases in 30 years of practice to trust a victory that had not yet been notarized by a judge. He was right to warn me. Greed, I have learned, sharpens some people rather than dulling them. Cordelia was not a woman who simply enjoyed the fruits of theft. She was, first and always, a predator's lawyer, trained to smell a trap the way a shark smells blood, diluted 1,000 times over in an ocean of water. 3 days after the Ignis Dynamics transfer, while I sat in my kitchen performing my evening ritual of staring blankly at nothing, Cordelia knocked on my study door and asked in that same saccharine, patronizing tone if she could borrow my watch to have the battery replaced at a jeweler she trusted. I handed it over without a flicker of hesitation, because a confused old man does not question his loving daughter-in-law. That was my first mistake in 6 months of flawless performance, and it was the only mistake that mattered. 2 days later, Declan called me again, and this time his voice carried a different kind of tension, the tension of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to deliver. "Roderick," he said, "they found it. The microphone in your watch. Cordelia had it examined by a private security firm before she ever went near a jeweler. They know. They've known for at least 48 hours, maybe longer." My stomach dropped the way it had not dropped in 40 years of business, not during the recession of 2008, not during the near bankruptcy of 2011, not even the night I sat beside Margaret's hospital bed and watched the machines go quiet. They knew I had been recording them. They knew by extension that I had been performing, that the tremors and the forgotten names and the confused stares into empty refrigerators had all been a magnificent, calculated lie built stone by stone over 6 long months. I waited for the confrontation. I waited for Lucian to storm into my study and demand an explanation, for Cordelia to arrive with a team of lawyers and accusations of elder fraud, for the entire architecture of my careful trap to collapse in a single furious afternoon. It never came. Instead, something far more chilling happened. Lucian began visiting more often, bringing groceries I did not need, sitting with me for hours asking about my childhood, about Margaret, about the early days of Beaumont Freight, his eyes wide and warm and full of a devotion that had not existed 6 months earlier. Cordelia started bringing homemade soup, sitting beside my bed on Sunday afternoons, holding my hand and telling me how much they loved me, how grateful they were to have this time together, while I still remembered who they were. Even Brittany, my granddaughter, began texting me small hearts and photographs of her weekends, a gesture so unlike her that I nearly laughed out loud the first time it landed on my screen. It took me 4 days to understand what was happening, and when I finally did, a cold sweat broke across my back despite the warmth of my own study fire. They were not confronting me. They were not exposing me. They had chosen something infinitely more dangerous. They were playing along, matching my performance beat for beat, outacting the actor, building a stage of their own devotion so convincing that anyone watching from the outside, any judge, any doctor, any courtroom in the state of Washington, would see nothing but 2 loving children caring tenderly for a declining old man. I had built an elaborate trap designed to catch a thief in the act of theft. What I had not accounted for was that Cordelia, brilliant, merciless Cordelia, was no longer interested in simply escaping my trap. She was building a cage of her own, one with bars made of forged compassion and notarized concern, and she intended to lock me inside it so completely that no jury on earth would ever believe a single word I said again. I called an emergency meeting with Leland the following morning, and for the first time since this entire war began, I saw genuine worry cross his face. "Roderick," he said quietly, "if they know you're lying about the decline, and they're not exposing it, that means they're building something that uses your own lie against you." I did not yet understand exactly how right he was. The hunter had become the hunted, and somewhere beneath my feet, in the quiet, patient hands of a daughter-in-law I had underestimated at every single turn, a trap had already been dug deeper and darker than anything I had built for them. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late January, in the same 40th floor conference room where I had closed the deal that saved Beaumont Freight during the recession of 2008. I chose that room deliberately. I wanted the walls themselves to remember which of us actually knew how to survive a crisis. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, dressed not in my usual cardigan and slippers, but in a charcoal suit I had tailored 3 weeks earlier in secret, a suit that fit the man I actually was, rather than the man I had spent 6 months pretending to be. Beside me sat Leland, his briefcase heavier than usual, packed with wire transfer records, insider trading documentation, and a formal motion to remove Lucian Beaumont from his position as Chief Executive Officer on grounds of financial fraud against the company he did not build, and had never once been trusted to run alone. I had rehearsed this moment in my head for weeks, lying awake at 3 in the morning, replaying it like a film reel, until every line felt inevitable, until I could hear the exact cadence of my own voice reading each charge aloud, patient and merciless, the way I once read quarterly losses to a room full of frightened investors and made them believe in me anyway. I would rise slowly, the way an old man rises. Then I would straighten, and my voice would come out clear and sharp, the voice I used to command 4,000 employees across 12 states. And I would lay every document on the table one by one, while my son's face drained of color in front of the 9 members of our board. I would watch 40 years of his contempt for me curdle into terror. I had earned that moment. I had built it with 6 months of humiliating performance, of pretending to forget my own wife's name, of letting my own granddaughter roll her eyes at me across dinner tables while she scrolled through her phone. I reached for the folder in Leland's briefcase, my hand steady for the first time in months, ready to end this once and for all. The door to the conference room did not simply open. It was thrown open, hard enough to strike the wall behind it, and I turned expecting security, or perhaps the police I had quietly alerted the night before through a contact Declan had cultivated in the Seattle field office. What walked through that door instead were 2 paramedics in navy blue uniforms, pushing a folded wheelchair, and behind them, walking with the calm, unhurried confidence of a woman who has already won, came Cordelia, flanked by 3 attorneys I had never seen before, and a man in a gray suit carrying a leather folder embossed with the seal of the King County Superior Court. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Cordelia said, and her voice carried none of the saccharine softness she had used on me for 6 months. This was her real voice, the courtroom voice, crisp and merciless and utterly without warmth. "But this meeting cannot proceed. Roderick Beaumont is no longer legally capable of participating in board decisions." She nodded to the man in the gray suit, who opened his folder and began reading from an emergency court order, granted, he explained, under an expedited petition filed 4 days earlier before a judge named Wexford, who had reviewed, according to the order, extensive medical documentation, sworn testimony from 2 licensed physicians, and audio recordings demonstrating a pattern of severe paranoid delusion consistent with advanced dementia. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Audio recordings. My own recordings, the very evidence I had gathered to expose my son, had been seized and twisted, weaponized, turned inside out until my careful surveillance of their theft became, in the sterile language of a court petition, proof of an old man's paranoid conviction that his own children were plotting against him. Every hour I had spent secretly documenting Lucian's crimes was now Exhibit A in a case designed to prove I was too sick to know the difference between reality and delusion. Northgate Horizon Trust, the bait fund I had built to expose their greed, was cited by name in the petition as evidence that I had been secretly and irrationally hiding assets from my own family, a symptom, the petition claimed, of a mind no longer capable of trusting even the people who loved him most. "This is insane," I said, and I heard my own voice crack, not from performance now, but from something closer to genuine fear, a feeling I had not experienced since the night Margaret's heart stopped in a hospital bed I could not fix with money or willpower or 40 years of stubborn refusal to lose. I have proof. I have proof of everything he's done. I reached for Leland's briefcase, but one of Cordelia's attorneys, a young man with cold, efficient hands, was already lifting it from the table, explaining calmly that under the terms of the emergency conservatorship order, all of my financial documentation was now subject to review and custody by the appointed guardian, pending a full competency hearing scheduled 90 days out. Leland stood furious, demanding to see the judge's signature himself, and one of the attorneys simply slid the order across the table without a word, letting the ink speak for itself. Lucian had not said a single word since the door opened. He sat perfectly still at the far end of the table, watching me the way a man watches a building he has spent months quietly wiring with explosives finally begin to fall. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, the voice of a son delivering terrible news to a father he claimed to love. "We tried to protect you, Dad, we really did, but you kept getting worse. The doctor's appointments, the recordings, the strange companies. Mom would have wanted us to do this. She would have wanted you safe." I stared at him, searching his face for even a flicker of the boy who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my truck on the drive home from Little League, and I found nothing there but the calm, satisfied face of a predator who has finally cornered his prey after months of patient stalking. I tried to stand, to argue, to demand a lawyer of my own choosing, but the paramedics were already moving toward me, and I understood with a clarity that felt like ice water poured directly onto my spine that fighting now would only serve as further proof of the very instability they had spent 6 months carefully documenting. Every board member in that room, men and women I had personally hired, promoted, mentored across 2 decades of shared victories and shared losses, sat frozen in their seats, unwilling to meet my eyes, unwilling to risk their own careers by questioning a court order signed by a sitting judge. I searched their faces one by one, hoping for a single voice of protest, and found only silence, the silence of people who have already calculated exactly which side of history protects their pension. And I understood, with a bitterness sharper than anything Lucian or Cordelia had done to me, that loyalty bought with a paycheck evaporates the moment the paycheck feels threatened. Cordelia crouched slightly beside my chair, close enough that only I could hear her next words. And for the first time in 6 months, I saw the true face beneath the performance, sharp, victorious, without a trace of the daughter-in-law warmth she had worn like a mask across dozens of Sunday afternoons. "You should have known better than to record a lawyer, Roderick," she whispered. "I found the microphone in 4 days. I could have exposed you the moment I found it. Instead, I built you a cage with your own evidence. Everything you gathered against Lucian, every document, every recording, it's all mine now. It's all proof of exactly what I needed to prove." She straightened, smoothed her blazer, and turned to the paramedics with a brisk, businesslike nod. "Please be gentle with him. He's very confused, and he's been through so much." The last thing I saw as they wheeled me from that conference room, the room where I had once saved my company with nothing but my own conviction and 3 sleepless nights, was Lucian rising from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket, and turning to address the 9 remaining board members with the calm authority of a man who has just inherited everything he ever wanted. "Your script was very good, Dad," he said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, as the elevator doors began to close between us, "but mine has legal standing." The doors sealed shut on his smile, and I understood in that final falling second that the trap I had spent 6 months building for my son had somehow, impossibly, become the very rope now tightening around my own neck. The facility was called Serenity Ridge, a name so aggressively peaceful it felt like a cruelty of its own the first time I saw it printed on a laminated sign in the reception area. It sat 40 miles outside Seattle, a low, sprawling building of white brick and tinted windows, the kind of place designed to be invisible from the highway. The kind of place families drive past 1,000 times without ever noticing the lives being quietly dismantled inside. I had toured facilities like this once, decades earlier, when Beaumont Freight won a contract to supply medical transport vehicles to 6 regional care networks. I remembered thinking even then how efficiently these buildings were designed to process human beings, how the hallways curved in ways that discouraged wandering, how the doors locked from the outside and never once from the inside. They took my phone within the first hour. They took my belt, my shoelaces, the small leather notebook I had carried in my breast pocket for 20 years, the one where I once sketched the earliest routing algorithms that built my company's first competitive advantage. A nurse with tired eyes and a clipboard explained, in a voice flattened by repetition, that these were standard safety protocols for residents on the memory care wing, protocols designed to prevent falls, wandering, and what she called elopement risk. A phrase so clinical it took me a full minute to understand she meant escape. I was 68 years old, and I had built an empire that moved 40,000 shipments a day across 12 states, and I was now classified, on a laminated intake form, as an elopement risk, a line of ink that reduced 40 years of my life to a single administrative category. The room they gave me measured perhaps 210 feet by 12 feet, with a single narrow bed, a window that opened only 4 inches before hitting a safety lock, and a door with a small reinforced glass panel that allowed staff to check on residents without ever having to knock. Within the first 3 days, a physician I had never met before, a man who spent perhaps 90 seconds evaluating me before scribbling on a chart and moving to the next room, prescribed a daily regimen of sedatives designed, according to the paperwork I glimpsed once, when a nurse left it unattended, to manage agitation and paranoid ideation. I understood exactly what that meant. It meant they wanted me quiet. It meant every protest I raised, every demand for a phone call, every insistence that I was of sound mind would be logged as further evidence of the very paranoia Cordelia had built her petition around, a closed loop with no exit that any sane man would recognize as a trap, and any drugged man would simply stop noticing at all. I learned quickly to hold the pills beneath my tongue and spit them into a folded tissue the moment the nurse turned away, a trick I had read about years earlier in a report on nursing home neglect that Beaumont Freight's compliance team had once prepared before we won that medical transport contract. It worked more often than it failed, but the days without the sedatives were their own particular torment, because a clear mind trapped inside 10 feet by 12 feet of white walls has nothing to do but count every single thing it has lost. I thought about Margaret constantly, about the way she used to garden along the south fence of our old property, about the porcelain angels she collected on our travels, each one a small monument to a marriage I'd built my entire life around. I thought about the farmhouse, about the winter wheat I had planted as a cover crop that would now go unharvested, trampled beneath whatever celebration Lucian and Cordelia were surely throwing in my absence. They were, in fact, celebrating. Declan, who had gone quiet for 6 days after my confinement began, managed to smuggle a single handwritten note to me through a sympathetic orderly, a young man named Terence, who had once worked briefly for a Beaumont Freight subsidiary before it was sold off years earlier, and who recognized my face despite the fog of medication I could not always fake convincingly. The note told me what I already suspected. Lucian and Cordelia had moved with terrifying speed. Within 10 days of my confinement, they had signed preliminary paperwork with Ferris Crown Capital to sell Beaumont Freight at the deeply discounted price Declan had uncovered weeks earlier. They had transferred the deed to my mansion into a trust controlled entirely by Cordelia, citing my incapacity as legal justification. They had even begun making inquiries about selling my 60-foot sailboat, the one Margaret and I had named after her mother, docked quietly at a marina I had visited perhaps twice a year since her death, a boat I could no longer picture without feeling something twist violently in my chest. I would like to say I remained defiant every single hour of every single day, but that would be a lie. And I have told enough lies in this story already to know the difference between strategy and cowardice. There were nights, especially in the first 2 weeks, when the white walls and the locked window and the small reinforced glass panel in the door felt like the final proof that I had lost everything, that my careful 6-month performance had somehow summoned a punishment far worse than anything I had ever done to deserve. I remembered an old friend from the construction trade, a man Margaret and I had known socially decades earlier, who once told me over drinks that the cruelest thing about growing old in America was not the body failing, but the family deciding the failure was convenient. I had laughed at the time, certain it could never happen to a man as careful as I believed myself to be. I was not laughing now, and I would not laugh again for a very long time. But I had not built an empire from 2 rusted trucks by surrendering to a locked door. On my 9th night at Serenity Ridge, unable to sleep, unwilling to swallow the pills waiting on my nightstand, I found a small, sharp fragment of graphite lodged in the sole of my left shoe, a remnant from a pencil I had broken weeks earlier during my performance of confusion, tucked there deliberately months before, as a contingency I had prayed I would never actually need. I pried it loose with trembling fingers shaking now from real exhaustion rather than performed frailty. And in the darkest corner of my room, behind the narrow bed, where no orderly's flashlight ever fully reached, I began writing a sequence of numbers on the white wall, small enough to escape a casual glance, precise enough that anyone who understood what they meant would recognize them instantly. They were routing codes, account numbers, and a single phone number belonging to Leland's private line, a message meant for exactly one kind of person who might ever see it. 3 nights later, the door to my room opened after midnight, quieter than usual, and a nurse I had not seen before stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back tightly and eyes that moved across the room with a caution that had nothing to do with checking vital signs. She crossed to the wall where I had written the numbers, studied them for a long moment beneath the dim night light, and then turned to look at me directly for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "The code has been activated, Mr. Beaumont," she said. I did not recognize her. I did not know her name yet, only that Declan's reach, quiet and patient, had finally found a crack in the white walls Cordelia believed were sealed shut forever, and for the first time in 9 days, I allowed myself, in the darkness of that small locked room, to breathe. She told me her name was Mai, that she had worked the overnight shift at Serenity Ridge for 3 years, and that Declan had reached her through a cousin who owed him a debt neither of them ever explained to me in full. She would not say much more that first night, only that I should keep pretending, keep swallowing nothing, keep my eyes glassy and my hands trembling whenever the day shift walked past my door, because whatever came next would only work if Cordelia and Lucian believed, right up until the final moment, that the old man in room 14 had finally, completely surrendered. I lay awake long after Mai slipped back out into the hallway, staring at the numbers still faintly visible on the wall in the dim night light. And for the first time since the paramedics wheeled me out of that conference room, I allowed myself something more dangerous than hope. I allowed myself a plan. I need to tell you the truth now, the truth I withheld even from Leland for the first several months of this war, a truth so carefully buried that only 2 people on Earth understood the full shape of it before it detonated. I did not underestimate Cordelia. I want to say that again, slowly, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not underestimate Cordelia. I knew from the very first week I began planning this performance that a mergers and acquisitions attorney with her particular talent for dismantling defenses would eventually find the microphone. I knew she would trace the watch, examine the trust documents, and eventually reach for the one legal weapon available to a family desperate to seize control of an aging patriarch's fortune before he could stop them. I knew, in other words, exactly what a conservatorship petition would look like, because I had watched Leland draft one for a client 15 years earlier, a case that ended in exactly the kind of quiet, legal theft I now found myself living inside from the wrong side of the buns. The real trap was never Northgate Horizon Trust as bait for Lucian's greed alone. That was only the first layer, the layer I allowed them to find, the layer designed to convince Cordelia she had outsmarted a foolish old man. Northgate Horizon Trust was, in fact, something far more dangerous, a shell entity I had purchased 2 years earlier, quietly, through a chain of intermediaries even Leland did not fully understand at the time, from a disgraced financier who had built it originally to launder proceeds for a South American cartel operating out of the port cities along the Pacific coast. I had bought it deliberately, using my own name as bait, as a hollow, rotting structure that had already drawn the attention of federal investigators before I ever acquired it. Investigators who had been quietly building a case against its previous owners for 3 years without ever finding the final piece they needed to close their file. I want to be honest about why I did this. It was not in the beginning designed as a weapon against my own son. I purchased Northgate Horizon Trust as insurance, a contingency built during a period when I feared, correctly as it turned out, that Lucian's reckless spending on Ignis Dynamics would eventually attract the kind of scrutiny that could destroy Beaumont Freight entirely, scrutiny I wanted contained inside a separate, disposable entity, rather than the company that employed 4,000 families who had never once betrayed my trust, the way my own blood eventually did. But when Declan first told me about the sale negotiations with Ferris Crown Capital, and later when Cordelia found the microphone in my watch, I understood that the rotten shell I had purchased for containment could serve a far more precise and devastating purpose. If Lucian and Cordelia ever succeeded in seizing legal control of my assets through a conservatorship, Northgate Horizon Trust would transfer into their names along with everything else. And the moment their signatures appeared on the transfer paperwork, they would inherit not my fortune, but my liability. The full, undiluted weight of a federal investigation that had been quietly circling for 3 years, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. That is precisely what happened. Leland, working through my and a network of contacts Declan had spent 9 days rebuilding after my confinement began, confirmed for me what I had suspected, but never fully known until that moment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service had, in fact, formally opened a joint task force investigation into Northgate Horizon Trust, 4 months before Cordelia ever filed her conservatorship petition. They had been building a money laundering case, slowly, patiently, the way federal investigators build cases that need to survive a courtroom rather than a headline, tracing wire transfers through 6 different jurisdictions, waiting for the right moment to move against whoever currently held legal authority over the entity's accounts, a moment that had, without either of them ever realizing it, just arrived. By seizing my assets, by convincing a judge that I was too incapacitated to manage my own affairs, Lucian and Cordelia had not stolen a fortune from a helpless old man. They had, with their own signatures, on official court paperwork, formally and legally accepted 100% of the criminal liability for a transnational money laundering operation neither of them had ever heard of until the moment federal agents would eventually knock on their door. This was the true architecture of the trap, the layer beneath the layer beneath the layer, built not out of anger, but out of a lifetime spent studying exactly how contracts, deeds, and legal transfers actually function in the eyes of the law. My son had spent 6 months believing he was stealing an empire from a dying old fool. In reality, he had been carefully, patiently maneuvered into signing his own name and across the single most damning piece of evidence a federal prosecutor could ever ask for. Mai visited me 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, each visit brief, each conversation conducted in whispers beneath the dim night light of my room, carrying messages between Leland and me that Cordelia's surveillance of my phone calls and visitor logs could never intercept. Leland explained that the task force had been waiting precisely for this moment, waiting for legal ownership of Northgate Horizon Trust to transfer into new hands, because a prosecution against a family who had just, weeks earlier, forcibly seized control of the entity through a court-ordered conservatorship would be airtight, undeniable, impossible to argue away as an old man's confusion or a misunderstanding buried in decades-old paperwork. They needed one final piece before moving, proof that Lucian and Cordelia intended to liquidate the trust's remaining assets, proof that would demonstrate active, willful participation rather than passive, accidental ownership of a dormant shell they had never bothered to examine closely. That proof arrived faster than even Leland anticipated. 3 weeks into my confinement, Declan intercepted communications confirming that Lucian and Cordelia had scheduled a final signing ceremony, a celebration disguised as a business closing, where they intended to finalize the sale of Beaumont Freight to Ferris Crown Capital, and simultaneously begin liquidating Northgate Horizon Trust's remaining accounts to fund what Cordelia had apparently started calling, in private messages Declan managed to obtain, our new life. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Windermere Grand, one of Seattle's most prestigious hotels, with 60 guests invited, champagne ordered, and a string quartet booked for the occasion. They intended to celebrate the theft of everything I had built, with the same rotten money that would soon bury them both beneath charges neither of them could ever hope to negotiate away. I asked Leland, through one final question before the plan was set into motion, a question that had gnawed at me through 23 sleepless nights inside those 4 white walls. I asked him whether Judge Wexford, the man who had signed the original conservatorship order, had any idea what he had actually authorized when he stripped me of my rights. Leland's answer, relayed back to me 2 nights later in Mai's careful whisper, told me everything I needed to know about how deep Cordelia's preparation had run. Wexford had reviewed only the medical affidavits and the recordings Cordelia's team had selectively edited. Nothing more. A judge doing exactly what an overburdened court system asks judges to do every single day across this country, trusting sworn documents from licensed professionals rather than questioning the motives of the family standing in front of him with tears in their eyes. It was not corruption that had imprisoned me. It was efficiency, the quiet, bureaucratic efficiency that makes elder exploitation one of the most under-prosecuted crimes in America, precisely because it looks on paper exactly like love. I lay in my narrow bed the night Mai brought me this final piece of information, staring at the ceiling of a room that had held me prisoner for 23 days, and for the first time since the paramedics wheeled me out of that boardroom, I felt something close to peace settle over me. They believed they had won. They believed the old spider had finally been swept from his web, his fortune divided, his voice silenced, his mind erased by a diagnosis I had never actually earned. What they did not understand, what they would not understand until the doors of the Windermere Grand's grand ballroom burst open in front of 60 of Seattle's most influential guests, was that I had spent 40 years learning exactly one lesson that no business school could ever teach. The most dangerous trap in the world is the one your enemy builds for you with his own greedy, trembling hands, believing every step of the way that he is the one holding the strings. The Windermere Grand's ballroom glittered with the kind of expensive excess that only stolen money can afford, chandeliers throwing gold light across 60 guests in evening wear, a string quartet playing something delicate and forgettable near the far wall, and at the center of it all, a long table draped in white linen where the final paperwork for the sale of Beaumont Freight sat waiting for signatures. Lucian stood at the head of that table in a tuxedo that fit him better than the CEO title ever had, a glass of champagne raised toward the assembled crowd of investors, board members, and Ferris Crown Capital executives who had traveled from 3 different states to witness the closing of what they no doubt believed was simply another routine acquisition. Cordelia stood beside him, radiant in a gown the color of dried blood, her hand resting possessively on the stack of documents that represented, in her mind, the final and complete erasure of everything I had built. "To new beginnings," Lucian announced, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, warm and confident, and utterly without hesitation. "To Beaumont Freight entering its next chapter, and to my father, who I know would be proud, wherever he is tonight, resting comfortably, finally at peace." A ripple of polite, sympathetic applause moved through the crowd, the applause of people who had been told a beautiful, tragic story about a declining old man and his devoted, heartbroken son. Lucian lifted his glass to his lips, and in that exact moment, the massive double doors at the rear of the ballroom did not simply open. They were thrown open, the way doors are thrown open only by people who have no intention of asking permission. And the string quartet's music died mid-note as every head in the room turned toward the entrance. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents moved through those doors first, 6 of them in dark windbreakers with the Bureau's insignia printed clearly across their backs, followed by 4 agents from the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, and finally, walking with the calm, deliberate authority of officers who have made this exact walk hundreds of times before, 3 United States Marshals. The ballroom erupted into a chaos of gasps and scraping chairs, investors reaching instinctively for their phones, Ferris Crown Capital's executives already backing toward the walls as if physical distance could somehow protect them from whatever was about to unfold. Cordelia's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and final in a room suddenly gone silent. And then I walked through those same doors, and I want you to understand exactly what I looked like in that moment, because it mattered enormously, because I had planned every detail of it during 23 nights spent staring at a white ceiling. I did not arrive in a wheelchair. I did not arrive medicated, shuffling, confused. I walked in wearing a charcoal Brioni suit tailored precisely to my frame, my back straight, my eyes clear and sharp as the edge of a blade I had spent 40 years sharpening in boardrooms and shipping yards alike. I walked with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who owns the room he is standing in, because in every sense that mattered, I did. Cordelia found her voice first, though it came out cracked and desperate, in a way I had never once heard from her across 6 months of flawless, merciless performance. "This is a mistake," she said, stepping forward, her legal training rising instinctively even through the panic. "I have full conservatorship authority. Whatever you think you're doing here, you need to speak with my attorney immediately. I have documents. I have court orders." The lead FBI agent, a woman named Renata Kwan, who had introduced herself to Leland weeks earlier during the final phase of coordination, stepped forward and opened a leather folder of her own, her expression flat and professional. Entirely unmoved by 6 months of legal maneuvering, she had clearly reviewed line by line. "Mrs. Beaumont," Agent Kwan said, her voice cutting cleanly through the ballroom's stunned silence, "you and your husband filed and executed a legal conservatorship over Roderick Beaumont's assets 5 weeks ago, including full transfer of ownership and control over an entity known as Northgate Horizon Trust. That entity has been under federal investigation for money laundering on behalf of a transnational criminal organization for the past 3 years. As of your signatures on the conservatorship transfer documents, you and Lucian Beaumont became the sole legal owners and operators of record for that entity. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and elder financial exploitation." The words landed across that glittering ballroom like a building collapsing floor by floor, and I watched, with a satisfaction I did not try to hide, as the exact meaning of what they had done finally, completely arrived on my son's face. Lucian's champagne glass fell from his hand and rolled across the marble, spilling a thin golden trail toward Cordelia's ruined heels. "That's insane," he said, his voice climbing toward panic. "We didn't launder anything. We didn't even know that entity existed until the court transferred it to us. This is my father's company. He built it. He hid this from us." Agent Kwan did not blink. "That's precisely the argument your legal team will need to make in federal court, Mr. Beaumont," she said, "though I'd point out that ignorance of an asset's origin has never once been a viable defense against willful control and attempted liquidation of its accounts, which our surveillance confirms you initiated 6 days ago." Deacon Pruitt, the head of Ferris Crown Capital's acquisition team, was already halfway to the door, his associates scrambling behind him, none of them eager to remain in a ballroom, now crawling with federal agents examining every signature on a table full of compromised paperwork. Cordelia's carefully constructed composure finally completely shattered. She spun toward me, her mascara beginning to streak, her voice rising into something raw and furious that no jury would ever mistake for the polished attorney who had once whispered cruel, victorious words into my ear across a boardroom table. "You knew," she said, staring at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time in 6 months. "You knew this whole time. You planned this. You let us take it. You let us sign it." I looked at her, at the woman who had cut my meat into small pieces at a birthday party celebrating an age I had never actually reached, who had sold my dead wife's memory for a consulting retainer, who had built a cage around my mind out of my own careful lies. "I did not force either of you to steal anything, Cordelia," I said, my voice calm, steady, carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "You built this cell with your own hands. I simply waited for you to lock yourselves inside it." The marshals moved forward, and I watched as they placed handcuffs around Lucian's wrists first, his knees buckling slightly as the reality of federal charges finally overtook 6 months of arrogant certainty, tears streaming down a face that had not shed a single one for me during 23 days locked inside Serenity Ridge. He turned toward me one last time as they walked him past the head table, his voice breaking, stripped entirely of the calm authority he had worn like armor in that boardroom weeks earlier. "Dad, please," he said, "you can fix this. You have lawyers. You have connections. Just make a call." I looked at my son, at the boy who had once fallen asleep against my shoulder on the drive home from Little League, and I felt the old ache surface briefly before I buried it beneath 40 years of hard-earned discipline. "I already made my calls, Lucian," I said quietly. "I made them 3 years before you ever thought to steal from me." Cordelia did not weep. She screamed a raw animal sound that echoed off the ballroom's gilded ceiling, demanding lawyers, demanding immunity, demanding a phone call, her voice fracturing further with every word the marshals ignored as they guided her toward the same double doors she had once believed marked the entrance to her new life. Somewhere behind her, Brittany, my granddaughter, stood frozen near the dessert table, her phone still raised mid-photograph, watching her parents drag toward the exit in handcuffs, while 60 stunned guests whispered behind champagne flutes they no longer dared to drink from. I stood perfectly still in the center of that ruined celebration, watching the empire I had built get carried back into my own hands by the very people who had tried hardest to steal it, and I felt nothing that resembled mercy, only the quiet, exhausted satisfaction of a man who has finally, completely finished a job 6 months in the making. Lucian received 9 years in federal prison for his role in the money laundering conspiracy, along with additional charges tied to the insider trading Bram Ostrander's fabricated tip had lured him into. Cordelia received 11 years, her legal expertise offering her no shelter once prosecutors presented the conservatorship paperwork bearing her own carefully practiced signature. I did not attend either sentencing hearing. Leland attended both and reported back afterward that neither of them asked about me once, that Cordelia spent both hearings staring at the courtroom wall as though searching for an exit that had stopped existing the moment federal agents walked through the Windermere Grand's double doors. I reclaimed Beaumont Freight within 3 weeks, walking back into the 40th floor conference room and removing one by one every board member who had sat in silence while paramedics wheeled me out on Cordelia's orders. I did not raise my voice. I simply explained calmly that loyalty purchased with a paycheck had proven itself worthless the moment it was tested, and I replaced every empty chair with people who had actually visited me, actually questioned the conservatorship, actually risked something on my behalf when it mattered. Northgate Horizon Trust, once the investigation concluded, was dissolved entirely, its remaining assets seized by federal authorities, a rotten structure finally cleared from the foundation it had threatened to poison. I did not move back into the mansion Cordelia had briefly controlled. Too many rooms held the memory of paramedics and porcelain angels and a granddaughter's indifference. Instead, I bought 200 acres outside Sedona, Arizona, far from Seattle's gray skies, and built a single-story ranch house with wide windows facing the Red Rock Canyons, a place where Margaret's photograph now sits on a mantel I built myself, plank by plank, over 6 quiet weeks that summer. Brittany, my granddaughter, wrote to me twice in the following year, letters I read but never answered, uncertain whether the emptiness I felt toward her was grief or simply exhaustion. Perhaps someday that will change. Perhaps it won't. I have learned not to force forgiveness before it's earned. The lesson in all of this is a brutal one, and I offer it not as comfort, but as truth. Blood is only biology. It is not loyalty, and it is certainly not love. My son shared my last name and my late wife's eyes, and he still stood in a conference room and watched paramedics wheel his own father away without a single word of protest, because somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that my fortune belonged to him more than my life did. Family, real family, is built from behavior, not genetics, from the people who show up when it costs them something, not the ones who calculate what showing up might earn them. Some evenings I sit on my porch in Sedona with a glass of whiskey, watching the sun drop behind the canyons in shades of copper and rust, and I let myself feel the full weight of what winning actually cost me. I have my company back. I have my fortune back. I have my name back, cleared and untouchable. But I no longer have a son. Not really. Not in any sense that matters. And no amount of restored empire fills that particular kind of silence. I won the war. I am not certain, even now, that winning was ever going to feel like victory. Cruelty, I have come to understand, is not born from hatred. It is born from finally, completely waking up to what someone you loved was always willing to do to you. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to ask you something honestly. If you were in my position, watching your own child sign away your rights for a fortune they never earned, would you have sent them to prison, or would you have simply cut them off and walked away quietly? Tell me in the comments below, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.